Hi, this is the Everyday Economist, and in about 1 hour worth of this video, I will explain to you everything you need to understand the real reason behind Trump's tariffs. And I will argue in this video, as you will see, that despite what the administration, the news media, and the experts online and elsewhere are saying, these tariffs have almost nothing to do with trade and manufacturing, but have everything to do instead with the dollar and specifically the unsustainable levels of the US debt. And that's why these tariffs are coming into play. It's to control the value of the dollar being too strong currently, with the hopes of not only reining in the debt, but also the America's ability to refinance existing debt, but also issue new debt. And this is why these tariffs were launched. Now, will it work? Has it worked? And what is the future and the relation between all of these things? Well, let's dig in and explain to you what the argument is. So here's the argument. This is not about trade and manufacturing. In fact, the real reason for all of this is because Donald Trump in the US understands that the dollar is trading at too high a value, and this is bad for America, and I will explain why that is bad. Because if you're not familiar with economics, you might think a strong currency is good for you, but it's not in very specific circumstances, and one of which America is facing in spades. And we saw the headline, in April 2nd, Trump came out using an emergency power that allows the president, rather than Congress, to issue tariffs. And he claimed he's going to do it for reviving U.S. manufacturing and because America's getting ripped off. And whatever you think about that, you seriously cannot believe that in the long term or even in the short term, the aim here is that, I don't know, Mobile, Alabama is going to become a manufacturing hub that's going to compete with Shenzhen, China. I mean, if you really believe that, this channel is probably not for you if you have seen my previous videos. The point here is that that is all noise. This is all political distraction. The real reason is, and as I write here, is that this is all a strategic attempt to manufacture and purposefully weaken the US dollar, and in turn pressure the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates and reduce the real burden on America, which is the $36 trillion of debt. And he wants to do this all without passing new laws, raising taxes, or cutting spending, because these go against the current objectives that he has politically. He can't raise taxes, he has to cut them. That was his campaign promise. And despite Doge, we'll see later in this video, that's part of his austerity plan. He can't really cut spending because he's increasing the military budget. He has other initiatives that he has to fund, despite all the cuts that Elon Musk supposedly is doing. Spending in the United States is going up, especially when it comes to the debt, which is the real culprit here. So in other words, it's less about trade and Xi Jinping and more about debt and Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. Let's see why. So why is a strong dollar bad? And it's referred to as the strong dollar problem. Because currently the US dollar is trading at multi-decade highs, with the DXY or the dollar index hovering currently around 104 to 106. And that's significantly above the long-term average if you actually look at the graph. Now, why is it that high? Well, it's because of the recent raising of the interest rates in the past few years, which was also a reaction to all the COVID spending. Inflation got out of hand, and the Fed fund rate is now around 4.25%. And the dollar's role as a global reserve currency is also another factor. But it also has two major effects when the dollar is trading at this high a level. Number one, it worsens the trade deficit by making U.S. exports more expensive relative to other goods, especially from China or elsewhere. But more importantly, and I think this is the real reason, is that it keeps interest payments on the U.S. debt prohibitively high, with national debt currently exceeding $36 trillion, and the annual interest payment, think about this, the annual interest payment is now over $1 trillion. The debt itself, because of all this, has just become a complete macroeconomic risk. This is the real emergency, not trade. And Donald Trump recognizes this because his repeated claims on Twitter and elsewhere that the dollar is too strong reflects that deeper understanding and the deeper reality that dollar devaluation is actually one of the aims here, and frankly the very last remaining tools that he has to manage the debt without triggering political backlash or severe market panic like to the extent of the Great Depression. He's obviously caused market panic, but he wants to do it in a manageable and manufactured way that he's done this. Let's go back to that 1% and the interest rate payment as it relates to debt. So you can see here, when we say, 1% of the 36 trillion, that's $360 billion every year that the US has to pay just on the interest. I mean, if you took out a debt or a loan and you were paying 1% interest, you think, oh, great, it's very low. But if it came out to $360 billion, you've probably done something wrong. And that's more that the United States spends on veterans benefits and education. I mean, might explain why they want to get rid of the Department of Education. That frees up some money to pay for the education for the debt. And it's also the debt itself, the $1 trillion. It's more than the U.S. spends actually on defense and Medicare spending. I mean, just think about that. That's how insane and how prohibitively high this debt is, and that's why this is a real emergency. And it's important to understand this, and the reason I stress this is because getting the interest rate lower from 4.25, and because the dollar is too strong, you want to make the dollar weaker so you can make servicing this cheaper. And when you compare this to 2020 all the way to 2021, the interest rate was near 0%, right? Because they did this after the pandemic. They wanted to, inject the economy with quantitative easing and a cash injection to spur growth, and governments could borrow money cheaply, especially the United States. But now it's at 4.25%. So even the cost of borrowing money has just become absolutely crazy. It's quadrupled in such a short amount of time. And a 1% difference, if you say, well, does Trump really care about getting the interest rate down from 4.25 to 3.25 or even 2%? Absolutely. I mean, you might think it's 1%, but again, remember that 1% of 36 trillion. That's entire budgets of entire departments. So any basis points, any percentage absolutely matters here. And this is the real reason why Donald Trump wants to manufacture a crash with the hopes of bringing down interest rates and thereby making the debt more manageable. And it's also because it's the fastest growing item in the federal budget. The government's spending an absolutely crazy amount of money just to service this debt, which is getting absolutely crazy. So let's look at this in a deeper sense. And the deeper sense here is, how do you deal with it? So we've identified the problem, which is the debt is too high, even the interest payment on it is absolutely crazy. But how do you deal with it? In a perfect world, you have two main levers, two main buttons to push in dealing with this. You can push both or either. The first one is the Federal Reserve lever. Obviously, Donald Trump himself cannot control interest rates because of the separation between the executive branch and the Federal Reserve, and that's in the hands of Jerome Powell. If you want to see a video where I made previously on this channel talking about the outsized influence that this one man over here has, Jerome Powell, or frankly anyone in his position, you should go see it. I mean, this is probably the most powerful person in the world when it comes to dealing with the economy. It's not Donald Trump, as many would be surprised. I have a whole video explaining why. Now, I digress. The second lever that you could pull is the diplomatic lever. So you get China and the EU, the two biggest economic counterparts to the United States, gather them and say, okay, we should recalibrate our currencies and their values together and in conjunction so we're better aligned, and it facilitates trade and investment better. And you reprice the US dollar, you reprice your currency, and we'll all be happy. This has happened in the past in different forms, but this is the other path that Trump could pursue, and it's easier. But let's look at both and go through each one in more detail, and I'll tell you what's going on today and what Trump is really doing. So let's look at this first lever, which is the Federal Reserve lever. And again, Donald Trump can't unilaterally go in and lower interest rates. That is the role and the job and the power of Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. Nevertheless, that hasn't prevented Trump from airing his views and thoughts on what Jerome Powell should do. And he's been very vocal about it. Even in 2018, during his first term, we almost had a constitutional crisis of sorts, where he was very close to actually firing Jerome Powell in some way or shape or form, and Steve Mnuchin and others stepped in, and it was an interesting saga you can go back and look at. But the point here is that even 2 days after he announced these tariffs, before even directing his tweets at Xi Jinping, I mean, he has now, but this is just 2 days. The first person who got it, Donald Trump's wrath, was Jerome Powell. And this really shows to you that this whole thing has nothing to do really with trade or manufacturing as much as it has to do with the dollar and the debt and the deficit. And this is why he's saying it's the perfect time for Jerome Powell to cut interest rates. That's Trump's aim here. He wants to manufacture a stock market crash so that the Fed normally would, in circumstances like that, come and lower interest rates to pump the markets back up. Why does Trump want interest rates to go down? Not because he wants to revive the stock market. I mean, he crashed it in the first place. But it's because lower interest rates mean that the US dollar depreciates in value. And when the US dollar depreciates in value, that's great for servicing the debt and the deficit. And it also makes it easier to refinance old debt and bring in new debt to replace and pay back the old debt. Because remember, lower interest rates causes inflation of sorts. And inflation is absolutely great if you're someone who's borrowed money. If you take out a loan, do it when there's inflation, because what does inflation do? It means that today with inflation you're paying back the same amount on paper with a currency that's worth less, and you're paying back a currency that used to be worth more. So the person who lent you the money is really losing out, but you who's borrowed is doing great in terms of inflation. And now multiply this by 1,000,000, or even in the case of America, 36 trillion, and you can see the big picture here why Donald Trump wants lower interest rates. And this is the first lever. But Trump has, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on what your views are, hasn't been successful in getting Jerome Powell to do his bidding. So let's look at the second lever. And the second lever is the currency agreement lever. Again, this is the diplomatic route, and I would argue the much more straightforward path for Donald Trump if he were to choose between one or the other, because this one he could himself at least attempt to do, whereas the former with the Federal Reserve, he has legal obstacles, constitutional obstacles, more so legal than constitutional, but nevertheless, it would be very difficult for him to go in and take over the Federal Reserve. And you might be asking, okay, well, if we're going to do a currency agreement type of scenario, how does it look like? And the answer to that is the Plaza Accord. This has happened in the past. This is not the first time the US dollar was actually too strong. If you've studied economic history, you would recall that in the 1980s, instead of China being the boogeyman, it was Japan. They were the ones engaging in trade surpluses, running massive trade surpluses against the U.S. A lot of U.S. business leaders, especially in the auto and electronic sectors, were complaining to Washington about Japan. And the U.S. then, under Reagan, decided, okay, let's do the currency agreement lever, because Reagan also realized that he couldn't lower interest rates. And there's a long history of presidents, especially Johnson and Nixon, also fighting with the Fed. But it was really Reagan who came in and did the first major post-Bretton Woods currency agreement to recalibrate the dollar's value and make it cheaper. And as a result of the 1985 agreement, which happened in the Plaza Hotel, ironically acquired by Donald Trump in New York a few years after, the US dollar against the Deutsche Mark in Germany and the Japanese yen actually went down. And it was a good time for America again. It made their manufacturing easier. It made their debt servicing it easier. Japan really suffered. I mean, if you look at Japan's economy since the end of the 80s, they still haven't recovered in terms of the stock market, or very recently did. Japan is no longer that behemoth that it was in the 80s. And the dollar fell by 50% over 2 years. That's a lot. And it all came out as this agreement. And this not only helped, again, the deficit, the trade deficit, but also more importantly, the servicing of the debt, at least in the 80s, again, before things went haywire. And that's the second option. But there is a catch. And before I tell you the catch, here's a short video that I really like that just explains the Plaza Accord. I mentioned it in one previous video, and people were still not sure about what it did or how it came about. This video will explain, and I will tell you why something like this is actually not possible for Donald Trump in the year 2025. But watch this first. and see how similar the current situation today is to the one that happened in 1985 with Japan, but now with China.
In the early 80s, the U.S. dollar floated high against the Japanese yen and German Deutschmark, buoyed by the Reagan-era combination of tight money and a high budget deficit. That was good news for Japan and Germany because the high dollar meant a low yen and Deutschmark and low prices for Japanese and German exports, more sales, and more jobs. But the high dollar was bad news for the U.S. Higher export prices, declining sales, lost jobs, and calls for government protection. As Ronald Reagan's Treasury Secretary, James Baker believed that free markets made their best choices without government interference. But as a practical politician, he knew what would happen if the government failed to act.
The United States was facing a real prairie fire of protectionism. There was a lot of protectionist sentiment in the Congress. Legislation was being discussed, if not introduced, and it was our view that something had to be done about that.
To head off the threatened protectionism, Baker picked New York's Plaza Hotel as the site for secret monetary diplomacy. A 1985 gathering of finance ministers and central bankers from the G5, the big industrial nations. Their surprise decision, the Plaza Accord, an agreement to sell dollars on worldwide currency markets in an effort to send the dollar and American export prices down. Why would Germany and Japan be willing to give up the advantages of the low Deutschmark and yen? Finance Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg represented Germany at the Plaza.
Maybe a short-term advantages could be endangered when the other important countries, in this case especially United States, would be negatively affected, especially by a expanding trade deficit which created tensions also for the other countries. So we wanted a surplus in trade, but not as big as we had when the dollar was more than 3 Deutschmark.
Toyo Giyoten was Japan's Vice Minister of Finance at the Plaza.
Strong dollar made Japanese exports very easy, and very large Japanese surplus generated international criticism against Japan. Japan was concerned about those criticisms.
The Plaza Accord put the G5 back into the international exchange rate equation. Had they abandoned the policy of market-driven exchange rates?
Well, it was essentially a policy change, even though at the time we probably disclaimed the idea that it was a big policy change.
The dollar had been dropping, and now it dropped faster, down a record 4.29% the day after the Plaza, down almost 55% a year later against the yen. Had the new strategy worked? MIT professor Paul Krugman.
All the evidence before and since has suggested that intervention on the scale that actually took place should not have made very much difference. The usual experience has been that an intervention of the size, a few $1 billion, that took place after the Plaza Accord is something, if the market doesn't agree, the market thinks the dollar should be going up and you intervene to try to force it down, the market can swallow $20 billion of intervention with just a slight burp and then continue on its progress. So the intervention itself probably isn't the explanation. There's a second view, which some people call the slap-in-the-face theory, which was that the market was going crazy and the Plaza Accord, all these dignified finance ministers got together and said, the dollar is too high, it really should be going down, and the market sort of went, thanks, I needed that, and the dollar started to fall instead.
The dollar kept falling, and the finance ministers and central bankers were satisfied.
So you saw in the last video how the currency diplomatic route actually unfolded. And it worked wonders back then in 1985. I mean, I did include the last part of it with Paul Krugman, who's an idiot, but I still included him for the sake of context. I mean, if you think he's worth anything, go look up his prediction on the internet. Just type in Paul Krugman internet prediction and you'll understand why that's just one of the many other things he's gotten wrong. But going back to why that agreement that we just saw that unfolded in 1985 is not possible in this current year. So this is the second lever. It's also not going to happen. And why is that? Well, because it's not geopolitically possible. The current environment that we're facing is very different than the one in 1985. And you have to remember, this was not, the Plaza Accord wasn't something that people in Japan or in Germany accepted willingly. Their economies were growing super fast. They were doing wonders with exports. And the United States came in and kind of pulled the fruit punch away and turned off the lights, and they weren't happy. Go read the memoirs of all the bankers involved from Japan and Germany. They all regret it to some extent, but they really didn't have a choice because this was in the height of the Cold War. They relied on the United States for military protection, and they weren't as militarily independent from the United States. But that's exactly the opposite of today. China is not like Japan. They're a rival, not a partner. And I'm writing a book currently that actually examines the repercussions from the Plaza Accord as it informed and influenced Chinese policy in regards to their economy in the 90s and in the 2000s. And China actually watched very closely what happened to Japan and the lost decades that Japan suffered henceforth after the Plaza Accord. And they have actually built their entire economic system to be foolproof for another Plaza Accord and to not fall into that same trap of being too dependent on the U.S. through the dollar. And it's a book I'm writing. It's coming out in a few months, but it's not relevant to this video. The point here is that China is too much of not lack of a partner for America to influence, and the euro is much more united for America to go in and say do this and do that. They're fragmented internally within the EU, but as a whole, they're still united in the sense that they would not just budge to what the U.S. would say. And Japan, again, if they want to do a deal with Japan, they probably could, but Japan's influence compared to China and the EU is a fraction of what it used to be, and it's not going to cause a significant devaluation of the dollar. Now, Trump could call this a Mar-a-Lago Accord, and we see, I think Trump knows that this Plaza Accord in the year 2025 is not possible. So I guess he's chosen the tariffs as a way to kind of cause economic pressure and stock market crashes in these markets, which he did, to kind of force them to come to the table. In other words, if you can't bring them diplomatically by their own will and volition, cause an economic crash, hurt yourself a little bit as the U.S., but force the other countries to come to the table and talk to you. And that's what Trump is doing. He's going to tell them by force, if he gets them sitting across from him on the table, hey, the dollar's too high and you got to either adjust your currency or do something about it. And I'm going to crash your stock market if you don't. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So to recap, the solution, because the first lever we saw was the Fed, doesn't work. The second lever, diplomatic option, also doesn't work. So what's the new third option? Well, it's the second option with some added factors. If you can't bring them to the table by their own will and volition, force them to come, crash their economies. And the strategy here includes manufacturing a global stock market crash to shift capital into treasuries. So if that, even the diplomatic option doesn't work, Trump's view was to force the sale of equities, as mass sale of equities globally. And what happens when the stock market crashes globally in the past, 2008, 2020? Everyone just parks their cash into US T-bills because that's like this gold standard of safety. And then that in turn is good for America and their debt problem, because when people invest in treasuries, that's like a new cash injection coming to the United States, and it aligns with Trump's macroeconomic goals, which again have nothing to do with trade and manufacturing, but have to do with cheap debt, weak dollar, and monetary control. Now I'll break it down for you even more what these steps mean, because it's very important to understand what's going on so you don't get fooled. To put another way, to summarize everything that I've just explained, the real reasons for Trump's tariffs are as follows. These are the 1 to 4 steps. Trump's tariffs create purposeful volatility in equity and stock markets globally, not just in New York markets. Look at what happened in Singapore, in China, in Tokyo. All their stock markets crashed at historic levels. Some in the Asian countries not seen since the late 90s crash that happened in Asia, the Asia crisis. And this was intended to shake investor confidence and force a massive sale in equities. And as a result, the economic theory suggests that when capital flees risky assets like stocks, it should flow into safer assets like U.S. government treasury bills and debt, which also, again, as I mentioned, gives the United States government a fresh line of credit. If people are buying treasuries, that's like loaning the U.S. government money for 10 years, for 5 years, for 2 years, depending on which term note you buy. It's good if you have a lot of debt. And as more investors to buy treasuries, what also happens to the T-bills? Well, the price goes up, the demand for T-bills goes up, which pushes yields down. And again, that's also good if you're trying to refinance old debt. So with lower interest rates, hopefully that means the Fed will step in and try to rebalance and recalibrate. The end result is that the United States can issue new debt more cheaply, and it uses this new cheap debt to pay off older bonds that were at higher rates, effectively refinancing them at a lower cost. So it's a two-factor event. You get new cash injection at a cheap rate, and you use that to refinance the old debt that was a bit more expensive. That's the aim here, not manufacturing, not reshoring and bringing back factories into the U.S. That's not about it. Trump's goal is to actually service the debt and to inject new cash flow into the U.S. This is what the theory would suggest. But has this really what's been happening since April 2nd? Well, no. Let's see what happened. It backfired. And it backfired, and you could say, well, how could it backfire if the stock market crashed? Wasn't that part of the plan? Well, yes, and granted, that part of the plan worked. But remember, what about the second part? The second part was to crash the market, and then that in turn would force people to take their money out of the equities markets globally and park it and invest in U.S. Treasury bills. Because historically, as the theory suggests, every past economic crisis we've had, that's what's happened. People sell stocks and park their money in Treasury bills because Treasury bills are the gold standard safe haven investment. But for the first time, and this is rare, it's not the first time, but it's very rare, this didn't happen. This is unprecedented because what we saw was that the yield rate actually spiked. And what does that mean? That means because yields and bond prices have an inverse relationship, that means people were actually selling bonds in addition to equities. What does that mean? That means that be it debt or equity, everybody was selling America. They were selling American debt, they were selling American equities. And investors were telling the U.S. market, the bond vigilantes, as the term is called, they were saying and screaming to Donald Trump, hey, Donald Trump, we know what you're doing, and we rather hold cash than either debt or American stocks. We rather not have anything to do with the American economy, and we rather hold cash. And China wasn't backing down either, and China holds a lot of U.S. debt. And they also are, I'm betting, selling U.S. treasuries. And this is what caused the yield market to spike. And I bet you this is the real thing that made Trump pause those tariffs for 90 days, not the stock market crash. Because there's a video of Trump going around saying that people got yippee. It's not because the stock market crashed. They got yippee because the yield spiked. And that worried Trump way more than the stock market. And this again proves my theory that this is more about the U.S. debt and the U.S. dollar than it is about manufacturing. Because the stock market was crashing for a few days after April 2nd, but Trump really put his foot on the brake when the yield market and the yield rate started to spike. And that shows you that's his sensitive touch point, which is debt and the deficit and the dollar, not manufacturing. So it further proves the point that this whole show is about the U.S. dollar, because if the yield is spiking, it's making the situation worse. Not only are you not getting a cash injection to get new money in, well, you also are getting it more expensive to refinance old debt because the yield goes up, then you have to even pay out more. It's terrible, and that's what really spooked Trump. So the plan backfired, the bond vigilantes won, and this is a term I used in the past. I got a question, what do you mean by bond vigilantes? I'm sure, in fact, there is actually a Wikipedia page on it, bond vigilantes. It hasn't unfortunately been updated yet, I think the last time someone edited was a year ago when I checked this morning, but they should include this incident that's happening right now on that page for educational purposes for everyone, because this is a textbook example of bond vigilantes. When bond investors say we're not going to invest in the debt market or the equity market, it's a protest vote to Donald Trump to say, if you do this, we're going to pull our cash out entirely from America, both in equities and debt. And that's what spiked Trump out. Because if you're a major debtor, the last thing you want is people pulling your money out, because that collapses the whole house of cards. That's why Trump put his foot on the brakes. So now going back to the levers, what now? Trump has to re-examine his levers. The global U.S. currency agreement lever is completely gone. So what's the old lever that's left? It's the first one, the Federal Reserve lever. He has to deal with Jerome Powell in some way or another. And it's interesting that we're going to see what's going to happen now, especially when he's going to have some major legal obstacles in dealing with Jerome Powell. But let's see. So if everything goes to plan, the short-term prediction that I will make is that, going back to that first lever, Donald Trump will slowly but surely shift away his focus from China and Xi Jinping and towards the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell. And this is because China is not backing down. At least if China backed down and came to a currency agreement with Trump, Trump might have some salvageable moment with the second lever of a diplomatic agreement, but they're not. Because what's happening right now with China is that China historically has not backed down from any of their public disputes with America, be it the Huawei case, the extradition case, be it with COVID, be it with the first trade war. The Chinese have a history of dealing with Western powers, and the average Chinese person has a far higher threshold for economic pain than the average American. And also because it's a dictatorship, if you protest, you're going to be sent somewhere not so nice. So this is a classic case of Donald Trump, an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. And Trump realizes this, so he's going to focus and demonize Jerome Powell in the coming months. And to see if this works, I urge you to pay attention to the headlines that are going to pop up in the next few weeks. I bet you that we're going to see Donald Trump trying very aggressively to demonize Jerome Powell, call him incompetent, call him and play the blame game on him and pin this all on him. And that in turn will pave a path for Donald Trump to fire him some way or other. We don't know if he's going to be successful, but just watch the headlines. They're going to be slowly but surely, including the pundits, going to be turning the spotlight, turning up the heat on Jerome Powell. And Donald Trump will increasingly come out in the public and push for lower interest rates and a lower U.S. dollar. And if he does so, that's another sign that will tell you, blinking red flash, that, hey, this is not about the trade deficit or about manufacturing, but it's about the debt and the dollar. And inflation will get worse if he gets his way, because the debt cycle will also get worse. The dollar comes down, inflation gets worse. It's bad for the U.S. consumer, but it's good if you're trying to service the debt as the U.S. government. And we might even see a constitutional crisis from the Federal Reserve, or even a budget crisis where they can't pass the budget, and we might see a government shutdown if this is what's going to happen. All these are, again, indications and symptoms of a debt problem, not a trade or manufacturing problem. So we saw both the short-term and the long-term implications, and the whole reason for this trade war being rooted not in trade and in manufacturing and bringing it back, but really in the dollar and the debt that the United States has, the unsustainable level that it has it at. And you might be thinking, well, what's the root of all this? This is more of explaining what the Triffin dilemma is, because Trump is really backed into a corner right now, and any other president would have also been in his position. This is a generational problem. This is not a recent problem. The debt has been a game of hot potatoes passed from one president to another, really starting with Nixon when he went off the gold standard in August of 1971. And I mean, the only good thing that came out of this situation is the price of oil collapsed. And that's good for Trump diplomatically, because he's simultaneously trying to negotiate with Russia and Iran. And if you're negotiating with those two countries, you do want the price of oil to come down, because those are major oil exporters. And if you want them to come to the table to remove sanctions, having the price of oil come down is advantageous. And Trump is looking for a win because, again, this plan backfired. So if he wants a quick win, he can use the lower price of oil as diplomatic leverage to get a quick win, either in a quick deal with Russia or Iran. And we will see how that happens. But again, these are all connected, and that's the interesting thing. The news, the way it's reported, you might think these are separate events happening in a vacuum, but what I'm trying to tell you is no, these are all related events, part of the same chain that is the US dollar. So what is the root of all this? What is the common denominator? Well, it's the US being the world reserve currency and the Triffin dilemma, which I've covered in immense and great length on this channel. But let's dig a little deeper. And I made this graph to explain the Triffin dilemma. The Triffin dilemma, in short, is the conflict that stems from the US dollar serving as both the world's reserve currency, which it did after World War II and the Bretton Woods regime that was established, and also the conflict that it has between serving that role as the reserve currency versus the domestic needs of the currency, as it is also the currency of the United States. And I will admit, in modern sense, the Triffin dilemma is kind of overused to explain the problem that America is facing. I mean, it's a catch-all term that's used. Nevertheless, I would still argue it points to the misalignment of interests and incentives that emerge from the US dollar being the world reserve currency, and that to that extent it's a very accurate term and concept to use. Because on one hand you have foreign obligations. If you're the world reserve currency, you have to supply the world with US dollars, because a lot of countries depend on the US dollar to fund trade, and they also use it as central bank reserves to provide short-term and long-term stability in their monetary system, but also trade. I mean, you look at the petro system, oil, Saudi Arabia, despite some of the recent headlines how they've gone off the petro system, no, they still sell oil in US dollars. So if you're in, let's say, Singapore, and you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia because you don't have any oil in your own territory, you have to buy US dollars off the global market and give it to Saudi Arabia in exchange for barrels of oil. And because of this, the United States has to constantly push out US dollars. So their greatest export is inflation. And at the same time, their domestic obligation is to manage a stable economy. Well, what happens if you are the world reserve and you supply the world with US dollar? Well, the main way you supply the world with US dollars, and this is what the economist Mr. Triffin was saying, is that you cannot be the world reserve and a net exporter, because you have to be a net importer to supply the world with US dollars. That's the easiest way to send dollar overseas, is you buy goods. You print dollars and you buy goods overseas. I mean, think about it at an individual level. Let's say the whole world dependent on everyday economist currency, currency named after me. I would be in a good position in the short term because I have a printer in my basement. It's called the Everyday Economist Dollar Printer. I press that button, I print money, and Amazon accepts that currency as legal tender. So I take that money, give it to Amazon, and I buy a flat screen TV, I buy a car, I buy whatever I want. And that's good. That's why a lot of the Europeans, after the establishment of the Bretton Woods system and the U.S. as the world reserve currency, were saying the U.S. has an exorbitant privilege, deficit without tears, because it's the only country that can run a deficit but not have to borrow money literally to do it. They can just print money. They borrow in a different way, but they really can just hit the money printer and buy whatever they want. But that does something in the long term. You have that experiment play out over decades. You're going to run into problems. It's going to erode manufacturing because you're just going to get too used to easily buying goods from overseas because you can just print money. And that increases debt, and that also causes political instability. So it's a balancing game. Do you keep supplying the world with US dollars through export, through imports? Or do you, tighten your belt, start manufacturing, and try to be a net exporter? You can't do both of those things. And the U.S. is so far gone from becoming a net exporter that, I mean, for example, Greenland, which they want to annex, they call this an ice sheet of an island. The United States, this behemoth of an economy, look this up, has a trade deficit with Greenland. It imports more than it sells to Greenland. That's how bad the manufacturing has been eroded in the United States. Sure, it's pivoted into a service and financial economy, but if you think Trump is going to reshore manufacturing back again through trade and tariffs, good luck. It's really about the dollar and the debt. And it was fine until 2015. I have a whole video about this, that the US was doing fine, printing money and importing and all that until 2015. Because what happened in 2015? Well, let's see. So 2015, as I cover in this video called The Great Reset, Why You Will Own Nothing, China was, for the first time, started selling US debt. And that was a violation of the unspoken handshake agreement that the United States and China have. And this is something I've argued in this video, where I argue that when America allowed China to join the WTO in the year 2000, the understanding was America's like, well, we ensure the free flow of trade through our military and our navy in the world, and if you want to come in to this world and trade with the world, and we're going to allow you to do that, China, here's the deal. You get to trade and you will make money from it, but the deal is you will take that profit that you get from your net exports and you will reinvest that dollar and that money into US treasuries. In other words, all the profit you make, you will send it back to us through US debt, and that will provide us an unlimited line of credit that we can go and do wars with, bail out banks in 2008. And that's why from 2000 to 2014, the United States engaged in very unproductive net zero net return activities. Not net zero, but negative activities, negative return activities, negative ROI activities, that any other country who would have engaged in those activities would have been destroyed. But America came out pretty much unscratched. I mean, look at the Iraq war, look at the Afghanistan war, look at the corporate bailouts and the big bank bailouts of 2008. Any country that would have done that would have been bankrupt. The Soviets went into Afghanistan and they had a major war there. Their economy crashed a few years after that, and you can draw a straight line from the Afghanistan war to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the Americans survived that and thrived afterwards only because China was providing trillions and trillions of dollars back into as a line of credit from their trade surplus that America allowed them to trade with the world. They made money, and the agreement was, we'll send that money back. And then right around 2013, 14, 15, a lot of the wolf warrior diplomacy hawks in China rose up, like Xi Jinping and co. And they said, wait a minute, they're on the record saying this. Why are we funding America's deficits? Why don't we take that extra profit and build up our own military and our own economic infrastructure, which they're doing right now through the Belt and Road Initiative? And they woken up to this deal. They said, well, we don't have to do this. It's like if America allowed you, the viewer, to come into their block and do business, and America said, well, yeah, you can sell your goods in my block in this neighborhood, but the deal is you got to give me like 10%. And China was doing this. But then slowly but surely, China hired bodyguards for themselves, and because they knew they were going to have a confrontation with the United States, like they built up their military, and they said, hey, listen, America, we've made a lot of money these past 15 years. We have enough savings. I'm going to hire my own security detail, and to hell with you. I'm not paying you 15%. I'm paying you zilch. Good luck. Deal with it. And that's why right around 2015, China acted on that view. They started selling U.S. treasuries, which in simple terms translates to they were pulling the line of credit away from America. And America started freaking out. Oh my God, if China's not going to provide us with the money, who is? And that's why they started printing crazy amounts of money 2015 hence and forward. And COVID was the perfect smokescreen because they had a overreaction to COVID. When COVID happened, I'm not saying COVID was a smokescreen, COVID legitimately happened, but the reaction to the COVID pandemic was 5, 6, 7 years of no money coming from China, and they compensated by doing an overkill reaction. They printed trillions and trillions of dollars for a pandemic that really didn't need that much money for us to overcome it. And I have a graph where I show how in response to the pandemic, they printed more money than all the wars combined, including World War II. Isn't that crazy? It's an overkill reaction. But they did it because China wasn't sending the money, so Fed, being the buyer of last resort, had to print the money to make the difference up. And if you look at the political discourse in America, right around 2015 was the first time you saw both the Republicans and the Democrats get hawkish on China. Because up until then, the boogeyman was Russia, was groups in the Middle East, but China wasn't on the radar until 2015, and that's no accident, because that's when they started violating this unspoken handshake agreement of trade. We let you into the WTO in exchange for your trade surpluses given to us as a form of line of credit. And now they're not doing this. And this recent trade war that's happening is going to further accelerate that disinvestment from the United States, which in turn means the Fed has to increasingly step in, print more money, which makes inflation worse, which makes the debt cycle worse, so on and so forth. It's a vicious, never-ending cycle. And it's because America, instead of using that line of credit that China gave them, what they should have done instead is built up their own manufacturing. I think 2001 was the last window of opportunity for America to really step in and build semiconductor plants, build more data centers, things that were core infrastructure in the new 21st century. And instead, what did they do? They bailed out failing businesses and banks that should have gone out regardless if a free market really worked. They engaged in pointless wars overseas, and this is the result. They're going bankrupt. This is simply balance of payment. China did exactly what America should have done in those 20 years, which is build up key critical infrastructure that would have successfully allowed them to transfer from an old industrial manufacturing that they were after World War II up until the 70s into a modern high-tech manufacturing society that focuses on the top 5–10% of the global tech supplies that generates 90% of economic growth. They didn't. Americans invented the semiconductors, but the Chinese are the ones pumping out the majority of it. I mean, imagine you invent a technology and your greatest adversary is the one producing the majority of it. And this is the problem, because America should have taken that money, built that infrastructure in 2000, and they missed that window of opportunity. And this is what we see. It's only going to get worse, unfortunately. And this is not a new phenomenon. People think, oh, I said 2000 was the last window of opportunity. It was, but this is a problem that Americans have had since leaving the Bretton Woods system. Again, recall the Triffin dilemma about how you can't be the world reserve currency and also be a net exporter at the same time. Here's a video of Donald Trump who's clearly saying this in the 80s. Now, he's talking about Japan here. But just to tell you that history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme, when you watch this video, replace the word Japan with China and see if you see a pattern here. Watch for yourself.
I'd make our allies pay their fair share. We're a debtor nation. Something's going to happen over the next number of years with this country, because you can't keep going on losing $200 billion, and yet we let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And, hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country. Kuwait, they live like kings. The poorest person in Kuwait, they live like kings. And yet they're not paying. We make it possible for them to sell their oil. Why aren't they paying us 25% of what they're making? It's a joke.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me.
So you saw what happened there. This was the same thing happening in the 80s, but now it's much worse. America's more alienated in regards to China, and now they don't have a big buyer of last resort aside from the Fed to come in and buy this debt and keep providing new money that they can take and pay back the old money they borrowed, kind of like a Ponzi scheme. So China's out of the picture now. They're slowly but surely disinvesting from the U.S. Japan's left, but their economy's not growing. So they either have to find a new buyer, which means they have to find an economy large enough that can buy U.S. debt for a long period of time. I mean, China was the only candidate, unless Trump pulls off some miracle with Russia and Iran. Iran's pretty much untapped, so is Russia. Remove all the sanctions, allow their economies to grow so that maybe Iran and Russia could start also sending their trade surpluses to the U.S. Treasury and buy debt that way. So hopefully we can expand this Ponzi scheme for another 10 years before a crash. Who knows? But the point here is, what happens, just like an individual, when the money coming in is less than the money going out? In other words, what happens when your credit card debt goes higher and you don't have enough money to pay it? Well, you got to tighten your belt, just as an individual does. In economic terms, in macro level terms, if a country is in trouble and they have a balance of payment problem, it's called austerity. That's the word of the day. But in America, because Trump is a PR genius, he's a marketing genius, America's going through a silent austerity. It's going through an austerity right now. Austerity is simply defined as an economic policy that aims to reduce government spending and budget deficits through reductions in spending and simultaneously increases in revenues. In this case, it says or both, but this is what America is doing. It's trying to do both at the same time. And I'll show you how and why it's a silent austerity, why I added that word. Because in a traditional sense, like we saw elsewhere, austerity is very public. You come out and you say, we're cutting these pension funds, we're cutting these things and these benefits, and we're also raising taxes. That's the traditional austerity. But Trump is doing that, but he's just using very clever marketing to kind of mask it and not make it feel like a real austerity. Let me show you. So historical austerity, we saw it in Thatcher's UK, we saw it in Greece, and we saw it in Argentina. All these three nations at various points had a combination of austerity because austerity has 2 points. You either raise taxes to make the money coming in more, or you cut spending to reduce the money going out. And in many cases, you do both. Now, Trump's twist is he doesn't want to do austerity through legislation, but just through tariffs. And you can think of tariffs as a tax. And that's the tax portion, and Doge is the cut portion. And that's a very clever marketing, right? Just think about it. Let's dig a little deeper. So why is Doge a clever way to do austerity? Well, because it's called the Department of Government Efficiency, and it claims to cut waste. But in reality, it's just slashing indiscriminately public spending, social programs, and government jobs. Now, granted, there's a lot of inefficiencies in government, and it's good that it's getting attention, so good on them for that. But let's not pretend that it's just about efficiency. This is austerity. America has a balance of payment problems because the cuts are being framed as modernization, as efficiency, but really in reality it's the same playbook as before. Fewer services, leaner governments, just rebranded. And that's the spending cut portion of austerity. But what about the tax portion to increase the money coming in if China is not going to send their trade surpluses your way? And taxes, in the portion of it, is in the form of tariffs. Because think about tariffs. If you're a free market person, tariffs are very clearly just a hidden tax on consumption. It's stealth austerity for that reason. And it also disproportionately impacts lower and middle income Americans. And it's very similar in terms of its impact to the regressive taxes like the value-added tax. You think about the ones they put in the EU crisis in Argentina. It's the same thing, just a different name. It makes it appear that China's paying that tax and not the American consumer, but it really is the American consumer. And sure, it does generate revenues in the short run, but the repercussions are that other countries will put tariffs on you, and it just makes the whatever value and gains you get in the short run really irrelevant in the long run. And importantly, the fact of the matter is, for Trump in terms of politics, it avoids the political fallout that tax hikes have. Anytime there's tax hikes and austerity, just look at these photos, protests break out en masse, and for good reason. And this is why Trump deep down knows this. I mean, look at his tweets. Why would he call tariffs medicine? Probably that was a Freudian slip on his part, because he says tariffs are great, we need it, it's beautiful, it should be a permanent feature, but at the same time he calls it medicine. Now, you only take medicine for short-term times if you're sick, if you have an illness, and that illness, he knows, it's the debt. He has to tighten America's belt because they're facing austerity, and that's why he calls it medicine. Again, probably a Freudian slip, but who knows? So again, to wrap this whole thing up, I'm bringing this slide back, the short-term predictions, that hopefully now everything makes sense. And if you want to understand the historical context of how we got here with the US dollar and why it is in such a bad position that it is now in relation to the debt and how it's unsustainable, go watch that video, The Great Reset, Why You Will Own Nothing. It's the first video on my channel. I'm also bringing out a book in a few months that covers the historical origin of the Bretton Woods system, the petrodollar system, the Japan-Asia crisis, and all the way to the present day, in terms of giving a history of where the dollar originated from in a modern sense under the fiat regime, what happened to it, and where it's headed. And that will be in that book. But for the short term, the predictions that I made are just here. I'm not going to repeat it as we covered this, but let's also look at the long term again. I think that's going to be more impactful for viewers and also for the purposes of this video. So in the long term, right, taking a bird's eye view thousand-foot view is that Trump's approach is aggressive, it's unilateral, and politically populist. And frankly, you can't blame him because it's really one of the few tools he has left to force a rebalancing, even if it risks breaking the old system in the process. Someone had to do this. Again, the debt crisis that America faces is a game of generational hot potatoes. If Trump didn't do it, the next president had to do it. And frankly, other presidents should have dealt with it earlier instead of going on foreign adventures and bailouts. So both sides of the aisle have a lot to blame for the state of the dollar. And this is precisely what we're witnessing because, as I will argue, we're at the early stages. This is the precipice of a historical shift in the geopolitical and economic order of the world. It's the early stages of the unraveling of the post-World War II international order that emerged out of the Bretton Woods system. And this was originally built, that emerged, and remember, after World War II, there was military alignment and security interest, and that first military then translated into the economic alignment. So military alignment led to economic alignment, and it was later reinforced by decades of trade and partnership and through bilateral agreements. And what's concerning about the instability that's going to come and get worse soon is that we are now seeing this in reverse, because today we are seeing the collapse of the economic consensus first instead of the military alignment. So we're seeing protectionism, currency battles, weaponized debt, and frankly weaponized dollar through sanction and financial fragmentation and decoupling. And my worry is, as history has often shown, economic fragmentation eventually leads to geopolitical and military fragmentation. So whereas in the aftermath of World War II, we saw military interests lead to economic interests, now we're seeing that in reverse. Economic disinterest leading to military disinterest. And if the dollar's role as the anchor of the global system continues to fracture, and if the U.S. simultaneously retreats from its position either in NATO or the EU or its role as the world protector of the international order, the economic core that is at play is going to fracture, and what follows may not just be another monetary regime, but a multipolar and more unstable competitive world order altogether. Unlike a lot of the, if you see this channel, you know I'm a fan of Bitcoin. I've been involved in it, talking about it since 2013. Back then I knew a lot less about it, but now I speak about it with more reason and frankly a little bit more authority. But despite that, I'm still very much of a believer that the dollar is more resilient than people give it credit for. So I'm not saying the dollar is going away tomorrow. No. The dollar, because it's built, unlike other reserve currencies in the past, like the Dutch or the French or the English, the global banking system is actually the veins, the organs of the global financial system is predicated on the dollar. So it's not just the dollar, it's the infrastructure beneath it. And that's a much trickier system for it to just disappear and disintegrate in a matter of days, weeks, or years. So this is something that we're going to see over decades. We might see the early signs happening in quick succession very quickly: economic decoupling, military engagements directly or indirectly, and more talk about Greenland and Canada annexation. And it makes sense, right? These are both very resource-rich countries, and if you're facing a debt problem, the best way to fix that debt is to bring in new minerals, new resources, new land and opportunities into your system so that you could kind of outrun the debt by increasing your GDP through annexing territory and annexing resource-rich countries. So that could possibly be another reason of how all this is connected. But again, I'm saying the dollar is a bit more resilient despite what people say. So it's going to be around and going to stick around for a while. So if you're a doomer, I'm sorry to disappoint. My point of view is the dollar is more resilient despite the fact that it's in trouble. Another point I want to dispose: a lot of people say China is trying to replace the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And I completely disagree with that, because the Chinese are smart and understand that if they do that, they're also going to face the Triffin dilemma. That if they become the world reserve currency, sure, in the short term they might have some benefits, but in the long term that means they're going to hollow out their manufacturing just the same. And they've made the calculation in the long term having being the world's manufacturer is far better than being the world's reserve currency, because again, you cannot be both of those two things at the same time. You have to pick your poison, and China has, because they saw America drink their poison first, and they cleverly learned. So that's the long-term prediction. And that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you for watching if you made it this far and weren't bored. If you're interested in learning more about the debt, the deficit, the dollar, the Triffin dilemma, its history, its trajectory, and where it's headed again, the Great Reset, Why You Will Own Nothing, that video on my channel. I will also have the book coming out and will provide more details, the 300-page book about all of these things that I've explained. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens next, really, because because the plan has backfired. Trump needs a quick win, either diplomatically, as I mentioned, through a quick deal negotiated either with Russia or Iran. We will see some pressure there diplomatically. I do expect that, or either a quasi-semi-constitutional crisis of sorts emerging out of him trying to take over the Fed and fire Jerome Powell. And we'll also see down the line as we get closer to midterms and beyond, the debt ceiling and Congress shutting down government because they can't pass a bill and Trump stepping in, all of that. It'll be interesting. And I do also recommend, finally, please continue sending me any questions and comments you have. The videos are based on the questions you send me, especially if you have an opposing point of view. The more the merrier. I actually do enjoy discussing with people who have opposing point of views and debating that way more so than people who are in agreement, because that's the only way you do really learn. The only thing I do ask that you don't message me about, which I still get, is whether I have a Patreon or a way you can pay me or send money in donations. Please don't. I don't accept money. I never have, not for this channel. I support myself. This channel is free and for the purposes of educating people to be more informed individuals within their communities and countries, wherever they may be. I don't accept money, and I highly suggest you do keep your money to yourself, because given the state of the economy and how things are headed with inflation, you're going to need it. That's all for today in this video. Thank you for watching, and all the best.